the lives of children growing up in poverty with those who are growing up in more privileged and economically affluent, families, this story isn't really about one single resource.
Thanks all for joining us today. I'm super thrilled to have Dr. Eric Deering join us. Eric and I have known each other for, I was calculating this before we went on, like over 20 years.
Wow.
Which
Wow.
is
That's
crazy.
fantastic. It really is. But you're right, because it would have been before 2020. Yeah. Oh my goodness. That's amazing.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
like,
Kind of makes you
oh
feel
my
old.
goodness. No, kind of.
Yeah, as we were just talking about, my teenager always says, she's like, "Oh my God, Mom, I can't believe how old you are."
Yeah.
Thank you, honey.
That's what children are for, right?
Exactly. They're building up your self-esteem.
Yeah.
Well, sort of thinking about how long we've known each other
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
sort of where we both, I think, have like taken research and gone different
Mhm.
directions. I think what's sort of so neat about your trajectory is it's led you in so many ways that have helped parents and
Mm.
children in their development. And I think most recently, all the work that you're doing with early math.
Yeah.
And sort of, I'm just curious to hear about like why math, sort of a little bit of background on, why math is so important in the early years. I think we often think about all these other factors, but, math as well, right? So how you kind of came to this place.
Oh, thanks so much, Aaron. It is a super duper pleasure to be doing this with you. And yeah, I hadn't realized it had been over 20 years, but I think about we being back in like those tiny little offices where you were a grad student and I was postdocing and yes, those were the days. But I really appreciate the question too, because it was not a direct route to working on early math, which is a lot of what I'm doing now. And it really was indirect in the sense that I started as a PhD student, really interested in the roles of family income and really kind of thinking about the impact of poverty on children and families and also the role of families' engagement in their children's learning and their partnerships or lack thereof with schools and from preschool through really kind of elementary school was where I was thinking about it. And that came out of but in between undergrad and grad school, I had worked for Head Start, and Head Start being a federal preschool program for families that qualify based on income. And so they were living in low income environments, and it's also a program that really encourages family engagement and learning. And both of those things, just through a number of family stories, families I was working with, I got really interested in, like, what's the story here? And that's where I started. But then, and was doing a lot of work thinking about how much does money matter and why does money matter? And does it matter if parents do get more or less engaged in school? And the short answer to both those questions was yes, money matters. And yes, it matters that families are engaged in their children's learning. And I guess I didn't really do all that research. It's relatively intuitive when you start thinking about it. But if like everything in science, we can make some things controversial that maybe don't seem so controversial to the public. But kind of trucking along doing my thing, and about 10 years after we met, and so about 10 years ago, a few studies came out highlighting the importance of early math learning. And I had not really, to be perfectly honest, thought a lot about math other than kind of as a school age achievement outcome. And so as you know, a lot of people in fields like ours are looking at children's development will measure, how well are children doing in reading? How well are they doing in math, through the school years? But I really had only been thinking about, like a lot of the rest of the world, honestly, about early literacy and early social emotional development during those early childhood years, kind of 0 to 5. And suddenly there were these papers saying early math is really important. I'm thinking, early math, what the heck is that? And and so started connecting with some folks who were doing early math research, both at Boston College, where I am, but then around the country and really internationally, and thinking about how do these um, contextual factors that I've been really interested in, income and family engagement, how are they related to early math learning? If early math learning is really important, and we're learning that these factors like, are you growing up poor? Are you growing up in a family that has opportunities to engage at school or not? Really matter for learning in general. It must matter for early math. And so really through connections with a foundation in California, the Heising Simons Foundation, they're now doing lots and lots of national work in education as well as in areas like climate science, and happened to have a connection with a program officer there who they were getting, that foundation was also getting really interested in early math. And her name's Holly Kreider, and she said, "Hey, Eric, we should put together a group to talk about family engagement in early math." And so we did that. And one of those people was Deborah Stipek, a developmental psychologist, trained at Yale, has been at Stanford for a number of years. She was the dean there for a while, and she had done a lot of work that made her on the kind of go-to list when we were putting this group together. And when we got together, she said, "Hey, I'm going to put together a network on early math, and it's going to be this diverse group of scholars in the sense of their areas of expertise, where we're going to have the greatest folks in terms of early math learning. We're going to have the greatest folks in terms of early math education. And hey, this whole idea around family involvement in early math learning and really kind of the socio-cultural context, we really need to get that covered as well." And so I jumped up and down and said, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, I'm your person." and and so it really kind of took off from there with what became known as the Development and Research in Early Math Education Network, or DREAM Network, we call it for short. So DREME. And that's what I've been working on now for like the last 8 years.
That's great. So I was just thinking, like in my head, as the mom of a young child as well, sort of
Yes, yeah.
when you think about family engagement and math, like kind of what does that look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it it looks like a lot of the kinds of things that we do in our day-to-day lives as families anyway. And so, math, it surrounds children and families in their homes, in their neighborhoods, in just the day-to-day routines that we're engaged in, from going grocery shopping to doing the laundry to setting the table to cooking, and and so a lot of children who are having experiences that are really diverse and building on one another, that are getting a lot of chances to be at the park and encounter all sorts of opportunities to think about the spatial world. And they're also at home listening to music, which is really has a lot of patterning in it. And they're at home, their families are talking about money, for example, or they're at the grocery store and counting out the oranges. And these experiences, as they build up across a child's lifetime during early childhood, are really enriching and build a foundation for math learning. That patterning is really a foundation for algebra. These, counting out the oranges and beginning to understand. We think about as adults that when we say, there are 1, 2, 3 oranges, oh, that means there are 3 oranges. It seems really intuitive that that last number we said, 3, is the number that there are of oranges. But it turns out we learn that. We don't just come into the world knowing that. And so children who get exposed to that kind of interaction and conversation with adults, with whether it's with parents or grandparents, or whether it's with caregivers in childcare or with a preschool environment, those conversations are really foundational for learning math in school. And so with DREAM, we've been helping practitioners who work with families, from librarians to social workers to pediatricians, as well as early educators who are obviously working with children and families, really kind of lift up and accentuate and build on those moments. And here, especially in the US, and interestingly enough, especially within the field of early childhood and the practitioners that intersect with families, math has often gotten kind of a bad rap. And so a lot of times we're also helping people understand that they really don't need to be anxious about this, and that the anxiety is something we want to kind of remove from the equation because it communicates all these messages to children about math. And so it's this funny thing where you still hear people very often say, I'm not a math person. And then you find out what they do for work. And so there are, anything from a contractor in construction who's using math like crazy to someone who's maybe a cashier who's using math like crazy to someone who's, I mean, you really almost can't pick a profession that's not deeply mathematical. And yet we still tend to talk about math in this really kind of scary way. And that gets communicated to children. So we're often also talking, thinking a lot about the messaging that we give as families to children and then also as professionals who are working with children and families.
That's really interesting, and I think I'm guilty of this as well. But sometimes you kind of feel like math is like the set aside thing that you do with your kids, whereas like literacy, we're talking to them all the time about what we're doing, and it's like you have to. At least I find I have to check myself. Like if I'm cooking, I'll be like, "Oh, look, Haley, we're gonna put a cup of water in," and
Yes.
instead of just sort of doing it and then moving on to interacting, like
I
planned
think,
interaction.
yeah, I think that's pretty typical too. I think part of that is because in many respects, the, not just the science, but, and maybe in some ways not the science, but in terms of just the ways we think about this out in the world. And so what our pediatricians tell us and, what we see in television commercials, public service ads, and so forth. Mathematics is kind of like 20 years behind literacy, if you will. We've
Yeah.
known, and it's really a very widespread message that you should read your child every day, even before they can read. And it's really become second nature. And I think the combination of math kind of carrying a little bit more pressure for some, that is they because they feel like for whatever reasons they had some bad experiences in school with math, or something else. You combine that with the public messaging being about 20 years behind, and I think it's kind of it's put us in a situation where, and we're often doing things like you're doing, thinking, oh, that's right, I should talk about, but and I have to say, I have to be totally honest, because my kids were already beyond early childhood. I have two girls, just like you, but they're older and they were already out of early childhood by the time I started thinking about this. So for me, it feels like, uh-oh, I completely
I
missed
missed
the
that
chance to do it.
boat.
That's right. But the reality is too, though, that there are so many affordances for children in the domain of early mathematics that it really is something that is, my good colleague Jilliana Meltzy, who is a colleague of yours as well, Aaron, at NYU. She really talks about a lot of it is about uncovering where families have strengths in early math, and so across cultures, across languages, regions of the world, socioeconomic status, humans are really good at math. It's one of the reasons we've thrived on the planet. And there are tremendous legacies of mathematics around the world and within families, in the games we play, in the
Brick City
songs
noise
we listen to. Yeah, that's good. I like that. Makes it real. Come on, we're
makes
not
it
in a
real.
studio.
Oh no.
That's right. Yeah, no, I love it though. I mean, I think a lot of parents can relate to what you experience. But that's all it is really. It's taking those little chances. And it's also not this thing. I think a lot of times people start thinking, oh, now I have to always be doing math. And the answer is to that is no, and no. And we want to follow children's lead. It's the same story we've been thinking about in terms of these conversations and interchanges with children that really follow their interests and keeping it fun and meaningful. And if it gets away from that, we're probably not doing a good job with early math either.
It's so interesting too. I think, you were saying like the messaging that we send to kids about math being scary or I'm not a math
Yeah.
person. And even just sort of the way that it's not like a natural flow often in just our
Mm,
routine, whereas so much of literacy is, I feel like, but
yeah.
the
Yeah.
math that doesn't always flow as naturally, at least it doesn't,
I
like I was saying, I had to catch myself in order to do it with Haley. And
Absolutely.
maybe that in and of itself is setting a little bit of a message, that
Yeah.
I'm kind of like
No, I
stopping
think,
for
yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I have to be, totally honest in saying we don't have all the answers yet in terms of what is the absolute best way to integrate more math talk, for example, into your daily routine, because there's a lot of things come up, just like your point. Like, we don't, it's probably not a good idea for it to be super contrived. And
Hmm.
so, imagine if you're cooking and now you're like, well, you know what? Let's step aside and do a little math lesson. But you remember, you've just started this interaction by telling your child, for example, we're going to bake some cookies. And so now you're saying, well, instead of baking cookies, we're going to go over here and we're going to talk about this how many idea. And that's really feels like a bait and switch sometimes to a child, and could be a
Totally.
little frustrating, and really not the way that we would have cooked together if we hadn't been thinking about it. And I think there is some real risk in that we don't want to overthink it. And I also, I think that the funny thing too, though, is that, as a parent of a toddler, that children really come prepared to be super interested in counting everything, for example. Like, once they start thinking about counting, then they're going to want to count everything. And the same thing can be true of these other concepts. And so we don't have to feel the pressure as families to build it into everything, and sometimes just let it go. But then there will be fun times where you say, oh my gosh, that's such an interesting thing, you notice that there are more ducks than there are geese, and let's think about that, and let's talk about that, and what happens if there had been one less goose, or gooses or geeses or whatever. I'm gonna get my
That's where the
plurals wrong
literacy
here.
comes in.
That's right, that's right. And by the way, right, it's such a good point you're making there implicitly, is that it's so intertwined, right? Literacy and mathematics. I mean, these, especially within the child, these aren't things we can just like separate and say, oh, this is literacy, oh, this is mathematics, especially within children's thinking. Yeah, we use literacy strategies to think about math, and
Which is
vice
so
versa.
neat,
Yeah,
right? With early childhood is that you can sort of, everything's so
absolutely.
intertwined. So
Absolutely.
interesting.
Yeah. It is. That's right. It's really true. And, it sounds a little bit cliche, but it really is about the whole child, right? There is this piece about we want to be thinking about them in holistic ways. And the same thing is true of their social emotional functioning. That's the piece about when I say meaningful and fun, so much of that is about emotion, right? And about relationships between us as parents and children and our children. And so if we're creating these contrived situations that are really frustrating, that's not fun for anyone. and
No.
and it's not likely to improve our parent-child relationships. Not the challenge shouldn't sometimes be frustrating. It is, right? And so we don't want to
Right.
always back away from challenge. We don't want to always, just walk away and say, oh, my child's frustrated. Sometimes it's a valuable lesson, and sometimes it's worth pushing through the challenge, but it's also not something, I mean, something we want to pay attention to in terms of our relationships with our children too. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. So Megan McCormick was on like now
Oh,
many
yeah.
months ago, but she was talking about, and I probably even have the terminology wrong, but her new study that looked at structured and unstructured sort of activities in the home and how they relate to early, sort of school readiness. And it was
Yes,
so much about the unstructured, right? The weaving in learning into the unstructured, but not this like structured set apart time that you did with the child
absolutely.
or activity.
Absolutely. Certainly not, oh, let's take out these worksheets. And not that, there are going to be some children, and I need to say this because I've gotten some pushback from some folks who said, my child loves worksheets. If your child loves worksheets,
Go
that's
for it.
great.
Yeah.
But if your child doesn't love worksheets, don't feel like you need to set up this formal math lesson. Yes, I think that's right. Yeah.
So, for those of us who are thinking about how to do some of these, sort of things with our kids and
Mm,
maybe what to look for when we're looking at schools also, I think for our kids, because
yeah.
that's another sort of so important, right, element of them learning is their school environment. What does the DREAM, where can parents find information on DREAM and sort of what resources DREAM has? Because I know, as I admitted earlier, I definitely have used them in my teaching.
That's great. Love it. Love it. Yeah,
But there's a
well,
wealth of stuff there.
there is, and thank you for that question, because that, one of this development and research and early math education network, we a little bit different from most research networks, is that we really, from the get-go, wanted this to be about not just research or development and research of materials and resources, but really disseminating to the world. It wasn't going to be very useful sitting on a shelf. And so we've been working really hard to get what we've developed and created for families, for early childhood teachers, for teacher educators, those folks who are training early childhood teachers, and recently, and for school, yes, that's right, just like you, and for districts, for school districts as well. And oftentimes now, as public pre-K is beginning to scale up across the country, this is really a district issue, and thinking about how they approach this in a coherent way from early childhood and on. And so we have a website, and then a number of different web pages that then contain all of the resources that we're developing. And that is really, I have to just give props to the Heising Simons Foundation, who has allowed us to do this all for free from the side of the user. So families and teachers and anyone else who wants these are freely available. There's no cost other than your time to go grab them. And so I probably should just memorize exactly what the website is. But if you Google DREME or Family Math Dream, you're going to find our websites. And embedded within there, like I said, they're going to be Family Math, is what we refer to our resources for families and for practitioners working with families. Anyone, as I mentioned, anyone from librarians to pediatricians that has touch points with young children and their parents. Lots of great resources. So cooking recipes, that lift up early math, games, card games, music, how to, talk about early math while you're reading storybooks. A lot of resources in those kinds of areas for families and practitioners. And then there are also a collection of resources for early childhood teachers. And so activities for center time, activities for transition time. So it turns out that children spend a lot of time in transitions in school in general, and certainly in early childhood classrooms. And these turn out to be sometimes challenging situations for teachers as you're trying to get from one thing to the next. You're trying to either get to snack time from a center time, or you're trying to get outside from being inside. And so a lot of also resources for thinking about how do you build early math into classrooms in a way that supports what you're already doing, including, for example, behavior management during transitions. and so so we have a website, and then a set of kind of sub websites, if you will. So all the family math resources are contained there as well. But if you Google DREAM, you'll find it.
And we'll put them in the show notes too, so they'll be.
Oh, there you go. All right, yeah. Should have done a better job when I'm gonna have to plug my stuff. I need to memorize the website.
Yeah. Hey, that was great. Thanks to Google now, I feel like you don't really have to.
Google does most of my thinking, so there you go.
You kind of alluded to this earlier about missing the math boat. No, I'm kidding with your older one, but how do you think? I kind of think about this sometimes. Having a career in this field influenced how you were as a parent, especially when your kids were in the house, even now too.
Yes. I love that. I love this question, and I love it particularly coming from you, because if your listeners, well, they probably don't know because they're just not meeting me, but I'm going to tell them is that you and I shared a dissertation chair. So Kathy McCartney, who's now president at Smith College, was both my district chair and Aaron's. And I don't know if you remember this, I probably have told you the story before, but this is going towards saying, initially, I found knowing more, as much as I do about child development, a little bit stressful. It provoked a little bit how you were describing the early math. And so knowing that you wanted to talk about math all of a sudden led you to say, oh, I got to talk about math. Well, for me, Kathy McCartney in my second year of grad school was teaching a seminar on parent-child attachment. And at that time, I had a 2-year-old in my house, or actually, no, she would have been a 1-year-old. She was a 1-year-old that time. She had just been born the year before, I guess. And so here we are talking about how important it is to be sensitive and responsive, and it really matters. And it really stressed me out. And I was just kind of obsessed with this idea of that I need to pick her up when she cries and be sensitive and warm and responsive. And so I would say, my first lesson was oh, maybe don't get so overwhelmed with the research and the science that you let it interfere with good parenting. But, I have to say that even turned into a bit of a lesson that I think I would even kind of highly recommend. Alison Gopnik has a book, and I don't remember the exact title, but it's something like The Carpenter and the Gardener, or The Gardener and the Carpenter. I can't remember which order it goes in, but it really is making the point that as a parent or caregiver, that your job is a lot more like a gardener than a carpenter. And in the sense that, the gardener is providing the environment for the plant to thrive, and along the way, doing some pruning to really, build on child strengths and maybe eliminate weaknesses. But it's a really different job than the carpenter who has house plans and is going to kind of construct this house exactly as they designed it, and they'll be completely in control. Well, it turns out that caregivers and parents, we're really not carpenters. And yet oftentimes I think we are. We're just much more like gardeners. And as I learned more and more of the developmental science, I didn't yet have the metaphors, the beautiful metaphors that Alison Gopnik came up with, but it is very clear in developmental science that that really is more like our role. And so I began to see that more and more. And that, in fact, was really kind of stress relieving, is in recognizing, oh, I don't have to construct this house kind of brick by brick. That's really not my job. And that I can be there to be sure if there are loose bricks that I can figure out where we find the cement to help it. But boy, I don't want to go too far down this metaphor path. Right? This guy can get carried away. But I do think the way that it really affected my parenting was to recognize that my role was really in trying to advocate and find the resources. And I will say too, though, that we've been in the good fortune and of the privilege to have opportunities to provide for our girls. And parenting can look really different when you don't have those opportunities. And so just kind of recognizing that as well, and making that explicit, that we were able to say, hey, is it horseback riding that you love? Oh, no, it's not. Well, is it ballet? Oh, no, it's not. Is it
Oh, yeah.
violin? Ooh, no, definitely not. Right. And so I think that though is really in many respects, when we compare, and this is kind of then going back to my own research, when you compare the lives of children growing up in poverty with those who are growing up in more privileged and economically affluent, families, this story isn't really about one single resource. It's not that, oh, you got to go to Russian math school, or, oh, you got to have Suzuki violin lessons, or no, but it is about that abundance of opportunities where children who have them are able to find their niche, and their parents are able to build on it, right? So in more
Yes.
disadvantaged communities, a parent who has a child, and teachers who have a child who's doing very well in math, it's treated as, oh, they're doing well in math, we don't have to worry about that.
Yeah.
Whereas in an affluent family, they're doing very well in math. Oh my gosh, they're going to be the next Einstein. We need to get them more math, right? And I
You're doing
think
math, you're
that,
doing chess, you're doing.
yes, that's right. That's right. That's exactly right. And so, yeah, so that's not exactly what you were asking, but just to acknowledge that I did begin to see what Alison Gopnik eventually began calling, the Gardner approach. And that was a really liberating. Given resources to invest in our children, it was really liberating to realize, oh, that's my job. And honestly, I mean, there are all these other pieces that come into play in terms of the socialization and things that really do, even under more liberating times, still feel a little bit like a carpenter. but there it is.
That's a beautiful metaphor. I love that, because sort of that's, I've come a little bit more to that place, like with the second.
Yeah.
And I have to say, my first, speaking about Kathy, she kind of helped me like take a step back, because I was like, pre-tenure, like very focused on attachment research, and there I had this
Yes.
like 6-month-old upstairs who was going through separation anxiety, even with like our babysitter that she knew well. And I was
Oh
sort of
yeah.
starting to spiral a bit. Like,
Yeah,
I'm moving my
absolutely.
child. She's not going to be securely attached. And then, oh, it's all over. And Kathy
Yeah.
came to see her and she was like, Erin, you're doing a great job. It's all.
I love that. What's so
Yes.
beautiful too. I mean, it just again, and I can completely relate. So Kathy's younger daughter, Kim, was one of Samantha, our older daughter's babysitters, and when Kim
Oh,
was babysitting her, she just had all of this stranger anxiety, and so and I felt really, just embarrassed about it. Like I must be doing something wrong as a parent. Well, no, it turns out temperament matters too. And it turns
yes.
out, Samantha, for that stranger anxiety turned into some strengths as well. And as an adult now and her conscientiousness, those things are all related. And yes,
Totally.
yeah,
Yeah.
but I'll give you, another kind of just a fun, liberating story. Another colleague of yours at NYU, Larry Aber, happened to be on a plane. We were flying home from a conference. I didn't know him at all, didn't even recognize him, even though I knew him by name. And we were on an airplane, but I was with my family, and at the time it was my wife, and then our then probably 3-year-old Samantha, and Samantha was just howling. I mean, just howling. The plane. It was a relatively small plane, but it wouldn't have mattered if it was a 747. Everyone on that plane was plugging in their ears, and Kathy McCartney was sitting next to me, or sitting next to us across the aisle. And in front of us was Larry Aber. And at one point, he turned around, and I don't remember exactly what he said, but it was something to the effect of, you know, it's not your fault. This is what children do, and we're all fine, and Kathy then chimed something else in, and I have to say, it just felt so, I put me at such peace the way that when Kathy talked to you about, you're doing great. So I think sometimes, even if we're developmental psychologists or training to be developmental psychologists, we need people to say, it's okay, you're doing great.
Yes.
Oops, I think you're on mute again.
I also think it's funny if you have young children and you're going to like a development conference or something with them, they will always have a meltdown.
That will happen. It's inevitable. It's inevitable. That's the other lesson. So if you're going to go into developmental psychology, don't travel with your family.
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, well, Eric, this has been great. Sometimes what we like to do at the end for folks to sometimes jog memories is like kind of 3 takeaways that
Oh
you
yeah.
would like them to leave with
Oh my
from
gosh.
your
Yeah.
careers, whatever, from all that we've sort of been talking about.
Okay. Let's see if I can do 3. I think one would just be that early math matters. 2 would be, though, keep it fun and meaningful. Let it arise naturally. All right. And then what will 3 be? 3, I guess, is just be willing to forgive yourself as a parent.
That's a great one.
Right? And in all seriousness, like I think it's not exactly what we're talking about, but I think indirectly it's related to that. And I'm embarrassed to say, or I just maybe a little frustrated to say, that I first heard that lesson from my brother-in-law, who's an economist of all things. When he had kids a little bit ahead of us,
I
and
remember.
he learned that, yeah, he learned that lesson that, we do make mistakes as parents, and you can kind of dwell on it, or you can forgive yourself and move along. And so I do think, even though it's not directly relevant for what we were just talking about, there's that piece. So there you go. Early math matters. Keep it fun and meaningful, and forgive yourself.
I love it. Perfect way
All
to
right.
end. Thank you,
Okay.
Erin. And for folks who
Yes.
want to like look at your other work as well as the DREME, what's the best place for them to find info about you?
Yeah, I think it's Google. I think
Google my name. I don't know.
Yes, that's right. So they can go to the Boston College website. I have a faculty website there. There is within the DREAM website, there's a lot about me there because it digs into each member of the network. And then if you're just looking for the individual papers, Google Scholar genuinely is the best place to go. So I think that's probably a good start.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay. Like,